No one on Earth noticed it at first, and that was what made the moment so unsettling in hindsight. The night sky looked ordinary, almost comforting in its familiarity, with aircraft lights threading across continents and satellites gliding silently. Above cities where people finished late shifts, locked doors, and went to sleep unaware that history was bending overhead. Astronomers were the first to sense something wrong, not because they saw ships, but because the stars themselves began to vanish. Entire constellations disappeared behind something vast enough to eclipse the background of the universe, not dimming or flickering, but simply being erased as if a curtain had been drawn across the cosmos. Instruments that had watched empty space for decades suddenly flooded with impossible readings. Mass signatures overlapping until software failed to separate individual objects. Energy output stacking so densely that early analysis assumed malfunction. Redundant systems confirmed the same result. Then independent arrays across different nations reported identical data, and the realization settled into every control room at once that this was not an error, not a meteor swarm, and not a natural phenomenon. This was deliberate, organized, and enormous beyond precedent. When the final count stabilized, the number itself carried weight like a physical force. 9,700 vessels had entered Earth's space in a synchronized emergence that warped light and twisted gravity at the edge of detection. From the surface of the planet, telescopes captured silhouettes that did not conform to human engineering logic. Angular and immense, layered informations that stretched across orbital distances. The sky above Earth was no longer empty space, but a wall of metal and intent, casting faint shadows that swept across oceans and continents as the planet rotated beneath it. In underground facilities and hardened command centers, trained professionals sat in silence not because they lacked orders, but because they understood immediately what this meant. Panic would have been easier, but panic required uncertainty, and this moment carried a terrible clarity. Humanity was no longer speculating about whether it was alone. Humanity was being visited by something that had already decided what Earth was worth. From the perspective of the invading fleet, however, the arrival was almost routine. Their sensors painted Earth as it always had, noisy with electromagnetic chatter, fractured by political borders, and dotted with weapons platforms that barely registered against the scale of force they detected no unified defensive formation, no mass mobilization that suggested preparation for a meaningful stand. The absence of resistance was interpreted as confirmation of centuries of observation, proof that humans were exactly what the galaxy had cataloged them to be: clever, adaptable, but ultimately divided and reactive. Within the flagship command carrier, officers reviewed projections that assumed compliance after minimal demonstration of power. Occupation schedules were drafted before the first shot was ever fired. This was not conquest driven by hatred or fear, but by habit, the way empires expanded simply because they could. Earth was not unique, not important, and certainly not dangerous in their calculations. Yet even in the confidence, a subtle unease crept into the command hierarchy, one that did not yet have language but refused to be ignored. Earth had not responded. Standard galactic doctrine dictated that a targeted civilization would broadcast something the moment an invasion fleet appeared, whether it was a desperate appeal, a fractured declaration of resistance, or a chaotic flood of civilian signals leaking fear into open channels. There would usually be noise, confusion, and a desperate attempt to be seen as relevant. Earth did none of that. There were no diplomatic overtures, no threats, no pleas, not even a panicked emergency transmission. The planet continued broadcasting its usual background chatter, entertainment signals, civilian traffic, weather satellites, all of it unchanged, as if the sky above it had not been replaced by an armada capable of sterilizing continents. To the fleet commander, a veteran of multiple successful subjugations, the silence was interpreted as shock. the moment when a species froze under the weight of inevitability before collapse. On Earth, that silence was intentional. Leaders gathered in secure rooms far removed from cameras and public scrutiny, where protocols written decades earlier were finally brought into motion. There were no dramatic speeches, no televised reassurances, and no attempts to rally public morale, because those actions belonged to conflicts that still believed in persuasion. This moment required discipline, not theater. Information flowed through channels designed to survive nuclear war and political collapse, reaching individuals who had trained for years to make decisions without emotion. The choice was not debated, because it had already been made long ago. In quiet fear and careful planning, humanity would not speak first. Humanity would not announce its intentions. Humanity would not warn the invaders away. Communication, after all, only mattered if one intended to negotiate. And negotiation implied uncertainty. Earth felt none. As the alien fleet advanced inward, deploying reconnaissance probes to map what they assumed would be a shallow and outdated defensive network, space around the planet appeared deceptively empty. Satellites powered down and vanished from sensors, weapons platforms went dark, and orbital traffic ceased in ways that suggested collapse rather than coordination. To the invaders, it looked like fear made manifest, a civilization turning inward, hiding behind its atmosphere and hoping for mercy that would never come. The fleet commander authorized the next phase of the invasion with professional detachment, confident that the coming hours would confirm everything his species believed about humanity. He did not notice the exact moment his first probe crossed a boundary that had never been announced, because there was no visible marker, no warning beacon, and no dramatic surge of energy to announce the transition. The probe simply ceased to exist. One moment it transmitted telemetry back to its carrier, and the next it vanished so completely that even its destruction could not be properly analyzed. A second probe followed and disappeared the same way, then a third, each loss generating confusion rather than alarm as technicians recalibrated sensors and blamed interference. On Earth, deep beneath layers of rock and reinforced alloy, a single indicator shifted state, unnoticed by the world above. No alarm sounded, no weapons were celebrated, and no message was sent into the void. Humanity did not announce that it had fired the first shot, because this was not a declaration of war. It was a confirmation of readiness. The alien fleet continued its advance, still convinced that Earth's silence was weakness, unaware that it had already entered a battlefield designed not to threaten, intimidate, or negotiate, but to erase. To understand why 9,700 ships had been sent with such confidence, one had to understand how the galaxy judged civilizations, and how thoroughly humanity had been misunderstood. For centuries, interstellar powers classified developing species not by potential, but by patterns. They watched how worlds fought wars, how governments fractured under pressure, how populations responded to scarcity, and how often a species turned its weapons inward rather than outward. Humanity's history, when viewed from a distance, appeared chaotic and self-destructive. A record of endless internal conflict punctuated by short bursts of unity that never seemed to last. To galactic analysts, humans were emotional, reactive, dangerously inventive, but ultimately incapable of long-term cohesion. Their wars were loud, public, and inefficient, filled with speeches, symbols, and moral outrage that suggested a species still fighting itself, rather than preparing for something beyond its atmosphere. By the time humanity reached the stars, the consensus was already set. Earth would resist loudly, briefly, and then fracture under the weight of its own divisions. This belief was reinforced by every observation the invaders had collected. Human governments argued constantly. Alliances shifted, even when faced with global threats. Responses were slow and contested. Economies competed where cooperation was needed. Militaries duplicated efforts rather than unified them. To the galaxy, this looked like weakness disguised as diversity, no single authority spoke for Earth, and no centralized doctrine governed its defenses. When the invasion fleet was proposed, the debate was short and almost procedural. A force of this size was not meant to fight Earth, but to make an example of it. The message was not aimed at humanity, but at other border worlds watching from afar. Resistance, the Empire believed, was a problem solved by scale. Yet what the invaders failed to understand was that humanity's greatest adaptations had never been visible from orbit. Human history had taught painful lessons, not about conquest, but about survival under uncertainty. Every internal conflict, every near collapse, every moment where extinction felt possible had forced humanity to build redundancies, fallbacks, and quiet agreements that did not rely on unity of opinion, only unity of outcome. Humans did not agree easily, but when threatened, they prepared obsessively, often in ways that appeared inefficient or paranoid, until the moment those preparations became necessary. Earth's defenses were not built to look impressive, nor to intimidate, nor even to win quickly. They were built to endure, to absorb first contact, and to function even when command structures failed. As the alien fleet advanced deeper into Earth space, their confidence remained largely intact. The disappearance of probes was irritating, but not unprecedented. Unknown anomalies existed around countless worlds, and early losses were often attributed to local phenomena or outdated technology colliding with modern systems. Fleet doctrine emphasized overwhelming response, not cautious retreat, and so additional reconnaissance units were dispatched in tighter formations, supported by sensor sweeps powerful enough to strip atmospheres from smaller moons. Still, Earth did not respond. No targeting locks were detected. No defensive grid revealed itself. To the invaders, it felt like shouting into a void and hearing nothing back. And that silence was interpreted as fear, the same kind they had seen countless times before. On Earth, that interpretation was anticipated. Human commanders watched the alien fleet's movements with cold precision, tracking how quickly formations adjusted, how command hierarchies responded to uncertainty, and how much autonomy individual units possessed. This was not passive observation, but analysis, the kind that built psychological profiles rather than battle plans. Humans had learned long ago that wars were not decided solely by firepower, but by how an enemy reacted when expectations were violated. The invaders expected chaos, desperation, and emotional response. Instead, they were being met with nothing at all, and that absence was beginning to distort their decision-making. In subtle ways, as hours passed, alien commanders began pushing the timetable forward, not out of strategy, but irritation. The longer Earth remained silent, the more the invasion began to feel anticlimactic, and complacency crept in where caution should have taken root. The fleet's sheer size became a liability, stretching coordination and increasing dependence on centralized command nodes. Entire wings drifted slightly off optimal positions, their crews relaxed by the absence of resistance. To them, Earth was already conquered in principle, and the remaining steps felt like paperwork rather than warfare. What none of them realized was that Earth's silence was not the sound of submission, but the sound of restraint. Humanity was letting the fleet come closer, not because it had to, but because it chose to. Every kilometer the invaders advanced was another layer of Earth's defenses quietly activating, another variable locked into place, another trap fully armed. Human doctrine did not seek to repel first contact. It sought to define it. And as the alien fleet continued its advance, convinced it was approaching the moment of victory, it crossed deeper into a space that had been measured, mapped, and prepared with a patience the galaxy had never attributed to humans. By the time the first alien captain began to wonder why his long-range sensors felt increasingly unreliable, it was already too late to ask the question that mattered. Earth was not reacting to the invasion. Earth was executing something it had planned for a very long time. The first true sign that something was wrong did not arrive as an explosion or a warning, but as a discrepancy so small that it almost escaped notice. An alien destroyer on the outer edge of the advancing formation reported a brief sensor lag. A fraction of a second where expected telemetry failed to resolve before stabilizing again. The ship's crew logged it as interference and moved on, unaware that several human systems had just finished mapping their exact position, energy profile, and structural tolerances. Across the fleet, similar anomalies appeared and vanished, each one dismissed as noise in a complex battle space. Confidence remained high, and that confidence was precisely what allowed the moment to unfold as it did. Without fanfare or visible buildup, one of the alien capital ships ceased to exist. There was no blinding flash that lit up the void, no dramatic shockwave expanding across space, and no electromagnetic pulse that rippled through the fleet. The ship was simply there, massive and heavily shielded, and then it was not, for a fraction of a second. Sensors registered impossible readings as matter lost cohesion in ways that violated every known model of energy transfer. Then the data collapsed into absence. To human observers, the event was logged with calm efficiency, categorized as a successful test of a system that had never before been used against a live target. To the alien fleet, it was an affront to logic itself. Confusion spread faster than panic ever could. Crews stared at empty space where a vessel should have been, struggling to reconcile visual confirmation with sensor data that insisted nothing had happened at all. Command channels filled with overlapping requests for clarification, recalibration, and confirmation, while fleet leadership hesitated, unwilling to declare an attack based on an event that left so little evidence behind. Doctrine demanded verification, and verification demanded repetition. Orders were issued to adjust formations, tighten defensive fields, and prepare countermeasures against weapons that had not yet been identified. Still, Earth remained silent, offering no explanation and no message to frame the event as an act of war. On Earth, there was no celebration. The destruction of the alien ship was not treated as a victory, but as a data point. Engineers reviewed output curves and timing precision, confirming that the system had performed within expected parameters. Military analysts compared the result against predictive models, adjusting probabilities and updating engagement envelopes. The decision-makers watching from secure facilities understood exactly what had been done, and more importantly, what had not. Humanity had revealed nothing about the source of the attack, the platform used, or the limits of the weapon. The first shot had not been fired to intimidate, but to destabilize the enemy's understanding of reality itself. The alien fleet commander, now fully attentive, ordered an immediate halt to forward movement and demanded comprehensive scans of the surrounding space. Advanced sensor arrays swept in all directions, pouring energy into detection fields designed to expose cloaked ships, hidden platforms, and gravitational distortions. They found nothing. No human vessels appeared, no energy signatures betrayed the presence of a firing platform. It was as if the attack had come from the void itself. The commander's irritation gave way to a tight, controlled anger as he authorized a second wave of probes, this time escorted and hardened against interference. He would not allow uncertainty to dictate the pace of the invasion. The probes never reported back. They vanished one after another, their escorts following moments later, erased with the same clinical efficiency. This time, the fleet could not dismiss the pattern. Something was hunting them, something precise enough to select targets and powerful enough to ignore conventional defenses. Murmurs spread through command channels, officers lowering their voices instinctively as if volume alone could attract whatever lurked unseen around them. The fleet commander issued orders to bring primary weapons online and prepare a retaliatory strike against Earth's orbital infrastructure, convinced that even an unseen enemy would reveal itself when forced to defend something tangible. The retaliatory salvo never landed. Missiles and energy lances launched toward Earth simply ceased to function, their guidance systems failing simultaneously. their power cores collapsing before they could reach effective range. The implication struck the alien command staff with chilling clarity. Earth was not merely defending itself, Earth was controlling the battle space. The humans were choosing when and how engagements occurred, dictating tempo with a level of foresight that suggested long preparation rather than improvisation. The realization began to erode confidence at the edges, not as fear, but as something more dangerous, doubt. For the first time since the fleet had entered Earth space, the commander considered the possibility that the intelligence assessments had been catastrophically incomplete. The silence that had once been comforting now felt oppressive, a deliberate absence that forced the invaders to project their own uncertainty into the void. Earth had not announced its presence because it did not need to. It had not threatened because it did not intend to negotiate. The first shot had not been a warning, but a demonstration of control. And as the fleet struggled to adapt to a battlefield it could not see, the commander understood too late that the invasion had already shifted from conquest to survival. The stars above Earth remained hidden behind alien hulls, but for the first time, those ships felt exposed. Humanity had fired exactly once, and the galaxy would later understand that this restraint, more than the destruction itself, was the moment the invasion truly began to fail. By the time the alien fleet fully understood that it was no longer advancing but being studied, the psychological damage had already taken root. War doctrines across the galaxy were built on escalation and response, on visible force meeting visible resistance, but Earth offered neither. Instead, the humans allowed the fleet to exist within their system long enough for patterns to emerge, long enough for command structures to grow comfortable in their assumptions, and long enough for small errors to compound into strategic blind spots. Alien vessels drifted within gravitational gradients they did not recognize as engineered, adjusting thrust and formation based on sensor data that was subtly, deliberately incomplete. Navigation systems began compensating for forces that should not have existed, burning fuel and stressing holes as they attempted to maintain cohesion in a space that felt increasingly hostile without ever appearing overtly dangerous. The fleet commander ordered a full tactical reorientation, pulling ships into tighter defensive clusters and preparing for a brute force assault on Earth itself, reasoning that even an unseen enemy would be forced to react if its homeworld came under direct threat. The order should have restored confidence. Instead, it revealed a deeper problem. The fleet's movement triggered a cascade of failures as ships attempting to realign found themselves drifting off course, their inertial dampeners overcorrecting, their power systems compensating for phantom forces. What had seemed like minor anomalies earlier now revealed themselves as a layered environment, one where space itself had been shaped to behave in ways the invaders could not easily model or counter. Earth had not built a wall or a minefield, Earth had rewritten the terrain. On Earth, analysts watched the fleet struggle with something humans had learned to respect long ago: complexity. The systems surrounding the planet had been quietly transformed over decades, seeded with technologies designed not to destroy outright, but to confuse, isolate, and exhaust. Human engineers had never assumed they would win a direct exchange of fire against a numerically superior foe. Instead, they had planned for denial, disruption, and attrition, creating a battle space where every action carried unseen costs. The goal was not to repel the fleet immediately, but to force it into making mistakes, to push commanders into decisions that felt logical within their doctrine, but catastrophic within Earth's environment. As the alien fleet attempted to initiate planetary bombardment, targeting solutions failed in ways that defied expectation. Firing arcs warped, energy dispersal became unpredictable, and weapons designed to crack continents scattered harmlessly into space. The few shots that did reach Earth's upper atmosphere were absorbed, redirected, or dissipated by systems that never announced themselves, leaving no visible trace of defense. To the invaders, it felt like striking a shadow. Every attempt to assert dominance was met not with resistance, but with irrelevance. The fleet commander's confidence fractured as reports flooded in from across the armada, each one describing systems behaving correctly in isolation, but catastrophically when combined. Crew morale began to erode. Alien species that had never doubted their technological superiority now whispered across internal channels, speculating about weapons that did not obey known laws of physics and defenses that required no visible presence, the absence of human. Ships became more unsettling than their appearance would have been. There was nothing to target, nothing to threaten, nothing to defeat in the traditional sense. The invaders had entered a war where the enemy refused to be seen, and every moment spent inside Earth space felt increasingly like time borrowed. Rather than claim doubt, the fleet commander finally issued the order no invasion leader ever wanted: to give a partial withdrawal to reassess. It was a measured retreat, framed as a tactical pause rather than a concession. But even the language could not hide the truth from those listening. The invasion had stalled. Worse, it had stalled without a clear reason. As ships attempted to pull back into safer formation, the environment turned against them in ways that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Several vessels failed to achieve escape velocity, their drives faltering as if space itself resisted their departure. Others vanished during maneuvering, erased as cleanly as the first ship had been, each loss compounding the sense that the fleet was being punished, not for aggression, but for presence. On Earth, no one celebrated. The data told a clear story, but it was not a comforting one. Humanity's defenses were working, but they were not infinite, and the longer the fleet remained intact, the greater the risk of adaptation. The invaders would eventually learn, as all enemies did, and when they did, the cost of the next phase would be higher. The silence remained unbroken, not out of arrogance, but necessity. Humanity understood something the galaxy did not yet grasp. This war would not be decided by spectacle or declarations, but by endurance and restraint. As the alien fleet struggled to extract itself from a space that refused to behave, a realization began to spread among its leadership, cold and inescapable. Earth had not been waiting to be invaded. Earth had been waiting to be tested, and the test was far from over. The order to withdraw should have brought relief, but instead it exposed the deepest flaw in the invasion. The fleet had never planned to retreat. 9,700 ships had been assembled under the assumption that Earth would break quickly, that resistance would be loud, disorganized, and ultimately futile. Logistics, command hierarchies, and operational doctrine were all optimized for advance, not escape. As ships attempted to pull back into coordinated formations, communication delays compounded into confusion, and vessels that had once moved as a unified force now behaved like isolated fragments struggling to interpret conflicting commands. Some captains accelerated too quickly, others hesitated, and a few froze entirely, their crews paralyzed by the growing realization that the battlefield itself was hostile in ways they could not see or predict. Earth space responded immediately to this disarray. Gravitational anomalies intensified along retreat vectors, subtle shifts that caused ships to overshoot safe corridors or bleed momentum at critical moments. Human systems, long dormant and invisible, adjusted dynamically, not to destroy indiscriminately, but to shape movement, herding sections of the fleet into increasingly constrained regions of space. From the alien perspective, it felt as though the void itself had grown intelligent. Responding to their attempts at escape with calculated resistance, vessels began colliding, not violently, but catastrophically, their hulls torn apart by stresses their engineers had never designed for. Others vanished mid-maneuver, erased so cleanly that nearby ships registered only a brief fluctuation in background radiation, before nothing remained. Inside the command carrier, the fleet commander's confidence finally collapsed into something closer to fear, though he would never have named it as such. Reports streamed in faster than they could be processed, each one reinforcing the same horrifying conclusion. Earth was not merely defending itself. Earth was managing the engagement with surgical precision, choosing when ships were allowed to move, when they were denied escape, and when they were simply removed from existence. This was not the chaotic resistance of a desperate species. This was controlled, patient warfare, executed by an enemy that understood restraint as a weapon. Attempts to reassert control through overwhelming firepower failed repeatedly. Energy weapons misfired or dispersed unpredictably. Command signals degraded as if intercepted by something that did not announce itself. Entire squadrons lost contact with central command, forced to rely on local decision-making in an environment that punished improvisation. Panic spread through ranks that had never known defeat, whispered fears slipping through disciplined communication protocols, as crews confronted the unthinkable possibility that they were not winning, not retreating, but being dismantled piece by piece. On Earth, the cost of restraint weighed heavily on those watching the data unfold. Human commanders could have ended the invasion swiftly by escalating to full annihilation, but that had never been the objective. Earth's strategy was not revenge, nor even victory in the traditional sense. It was demonstration. Humanity needed the galaxy to understand something fundamental, something that could not be communicated through threats or treaties. Humans did not need to conquer the stars to be dangerous. They only needed to make invasion unprofitable. Every ship destroyed without spectacle, every failed retreat, every silent erasure reinforced a narrative more powerful than any broadcast. Earth was not weak, merely unwilling to be provoked lightly. As losses mounted, a handful of alien captains made independent decisions to flee, abandoning formation discipline and attempting blind jumps out of Earth space. Most never succeeded. Jump drives failed to synchronize or engage too late, tearing ships apart in ways that defied physics. A few, however, vanished successfully, slipping beyond the distorted battlefield into open space. Human systems tracked them carefully, flagging each escape without interference. For the first time since the invasion began, Earth allowed something to leave within the alien command structure. The significance of this was not immediately understood. Survival instincts overwhelmed strategic reasoning, and any ship that broke free was hailed as a miracle rather than a message. But among Earth's analysts, the pattern was clear. Escape was not random. It was permitted. Humanity was choosing who would return home, shaping the story that would spread across the galaxy once the fighting ended. The invasion was no longer about destroying 9,700 ships. It was about deciding how many witnesses would remain to tell the tale. As the fleet continued to collapse inward, fragmented and terrified, the truth became unavoidable. The invasion of Earth had failed not because humans were stronger, louder, or more aggressive, but because they were prepared to fight in a way the galaxy had never encountered. And as the number of surviving ships dwindled, the significance of the final count began to take shape, even if no one on the alien side yet understood why 17 would matter. The chamber of petitions had never felt this heavy before. Gold pillars carved with victories of the Empire rose toward the ceiling, but now they seemed less like monuments and more like silent witnesses. Princess Althena stood at the center, dazed, her posture rigid. Her fingers clenched just enough to betray the storm behind her calm expression. The human's absence was louder than any scream. She had expected outrage from him, expected anger, tears, even threats, but never silence, never departure in the Empire's history. No subject had ever walked away from royal judgment without permission. The fact that a human had done so, calmly and without resistance, unsettled something deep within her that she refused to name. Reports began arriving within hours, each one worse than the last. The human envoy had boarded his vessel without ceremony, declining escorts, refusing gifts, and leaving behind a single sealed message addressed not to the princess, but to the Galactic Council. That alone was a political insult of the highest order. Humans were considered minor players, useful allies at best, expendable at worst. And yet this one had chosen the council over the Empire's mercy. The courtiers whispered that it was a bluff, a final act of defiance before crawling back. The generals laughed and said no species survived long without imperial protection. But Princess Althena did not laugh. She remembered his eyes. They had not been desperate, they had been resolved. 3 cycles later, the first consequences arrived. Trade routes once quietly maintained by human logistics fleets began to close. Repairs on outer imperial stations were delayed without explanation. Data relays that relied on human encryption suddenly required reauthorization that never came. None of it was violent, none of it was dramatic. It was quiet, precise, and devastating. The Empire had grown accustomed to human efficiency without ever acknowledging it. Now that efficiency had been withdrawn, and systems that had run smoothly for decades began to falter, the human had not begged. He had simply removed himself, and the void he left behind was becoming impossible to ignore. The sealed message to the Galactic Council was leaked soon after, and when Princess Althena finally read it, she felt something dangerously close to shame. It was not an accusation, nor a plea. It was a declaration. The human representative had formally withdrawn humanity from all auxiliary agreements with the Empire, citing irreconcilable differences in values, dignity, and mutual respect. He wrote that humanity would no longer serve where it was tolerated, but never trusted, where loyalty was demanded, but honor was denied. The most cutting line was not written in anger, but in clarity. We do not kneel where we are not seen as equals. That sentence echoed through the political chambers like a weapon no shield could stop. For the first time in her life, Princess Althena questioned the foundation she stood on. The Empire prided itself on strength, on dominance, on obedience extracted through fear and tradition. Yet the human had shown a different kind of power, one that did not raise its voice or draw a blade. He had chosen absence over submission, and in doing so, he had forced the Empire to confront a truth it had long ignored. Strength that relies on others kneeling is fragile. Strength that can be walked away from is not strength at all. Late that cycle, alone in her private chamber, the princess dismissed her attendants and stood before the vast viewport overlooking the stars. Somewhere out there, the human envoy was traveling back to his people, not as a defeated subject, but as someone who had drawn a line and refused to let it be crossed. She realized then that the moment he turned away from her throne, history had shifted, not because he rebelled, but because he refused to play the role written for him. And for the first time, Princess Althena understood that the Empire had not lost a servant that day. It had lost something far more dangerous. It had lost the illusion that humanity needed them more than they needed humanity. The alien armada had come prepared for annihilation or surrender, but it had prepared for neither patience nor silence, and that silence was now stretching thin across the command bridges of the remaining 17 ships. 4 hours after the failure of the final planetary strike, Earth did nothing. No counterattack surged outward. No fleets emerged from hidden docks. No triumphant broadcast echoed across the void. The planet simply continued to orbit its star, its oceans glinting calmly, its continents unchanged, as if nothing of importance had occurred. That quiet unsettled the invaders more than any weapon ever could, because civilizations that celebrated victory made noise, and civilizations that plotted revenge moved quickly. But Earth did neither. It watched. Sensors detected vast power, reserves cycling beneath the crust, deep space arrays reorienting, and communication relays lighting up in complex, layered patterns that suggested not chaos, but coordination. The surviving admirals realized, with growing dread, that the humans were not reacting emotionally. They were deciding. The first human transmission arrived without warning, not as a demand or a threat, but as a single, clean signal broadcast. On every known interstellar frequency, there was no encryption challenge, no grand imagery, no martial music or symbolic displays of dominance. It was simply a human voice, calm and unhurried, speaking in flawless galactic trade standard, clearly meant to be understood by every species listening. The speaker identified herself only as Earth's planetary representative, a title deliberately vague. And then she began to speak not of destruction, but of history. She recounted how humanity had once stood divided, how it had nearly destroyed itself through war, greed, and fear, and how it had learned, painfully and slowly, that survival favored those who adapted rather than those who dominated. As the message unfolded, the alien crews listened in stunned silence as the humans explained something no intelligence briefing had captured. Earth had not unified to prepare for war, but to ensure it would never be helpless again. The representative explained that Earth had known about the approaching invasion long before the first ship crossed into their system. They had detected the armada at the outer edge of the spiral arm, moving in numbers so vast that stealth was irrelevant. Humanity had watched, analyzed, and debated, not whether to survive, but how to respond in a way that would shape the future of the galaxy. The weapons that had crippled thousands of ships were not experimental miracles or last-ditch gambles. They were deliberately restrained systems, calibrated to disable rather than annihilate, because Earth had wanted survivors. Survivors would carry a message farther than wreckage ever could. The revelation sent a ripple of disbelief through the alien fleets, because restraint at that scale required confidence so absolute. It bordered on arrogance, and yet the results spoke for themselves. Then the tone of the message shifted, not to anger, but to something colder and far more unsettling: accountability. The human speaker listed the names of species, coalitions, and ruling councils involved in the invasion, each detail precise, each fact verified. She explained that Earth had already transmitted complete battle data, genetic evidence, and command records to neutral galactic observers, ensuring that no one could later rewrite the story. Humanity, she said, did not seek revenge, but it did insist on consequence. The surviving 17 ships were being allowed to leave, not as a mercy, but as witnesses. They would return home carrying proof that Earth was neither weak nor reckless, neither cruel nor naive. They would return knowing that humanity had chosen not to end them, and that choice came with an expectation the galaxy would remember. As the transmission ended, Earth's defenses powered down in a visible, deliberate act that stunned the watching fleets. Planetary shields dimmed, orbital weapons retracted, and energy signatures fell to levels that, in any other context, would have invited immediate attack. But no one moved. The alien commanders understood the meaning instantly. Earth was not daring them to strike again. It was declaring that the invasion was over, and that any further aggression would no longer be met with restraint. Humanity had demonstrated its strength and now rested comfortably within it, unafraid of appearing vulnerable, because it knew exactly how quickly the vulnerability could disappear. The 17 ships began their slow retreat, engines warming cautiously, crews moving with the quiet efficiency of those who had survived something that should have killed them. None of the admirals spoke as Earth receded behind them, Lewin whole and utterly unconcerned with their departure. Every surviving officer understood that they had not merely lost a battle, but had witnessed the arrival of a new kind of power in the galaxy, one that measured victory not by conquest, but by control of outcomes. Humanity had not begged, had not raged, and had not chased them down. It had simply made a decision and imposed it long after the ships vanished into jump space. The galaxy would debate what truly happened at Earth. Some would call it mercy, others strategy, and a few would finally recognize it for what it was: a warning delivered with restraint. Earth had spoken once, calmly and clearly, and the galaxy had listened. And somewhere in the quiet between stars, the survivors understood the truth that would haunt them forever. The humans had not won because they were the most violent species in the galaxy. They had won because they knew exactly when violence was no longer necessary. The retreat of the 17 ships did not mark the end of observation. In fact, It marked the beginning of a new, subtler war, fought in silence, in records, and in the shadows of every council chamber in the galaxy, as the surviving invaders crossed back into familiar space. They found themselves under scrutiny not by Earth, but by every intelligence network that had monitored the conflict. Every maneuver, every failure, every hesitation had been logged, cataloged, and contextualized. Humanity had not only survived, it had rewritten the rules by which interstellar war was remembered. The Armada carried with it a payload heavier than any weapon, the undeniable proof that a species could stand unassailable not through firepower alone, but through foresight, patience, and the quiet tyranny of preparedness. The very concept of dominance had shifted, because dominance no longer meant destruction, it now meant understanding precisely when and how to end it. On the decks of the retreating ships, murmurs began among crews and admirals alike. These were not debates of strategy, but of comprehension. How had a single, apparently primitive planet, so small in the galactic scale, rendered an entire armada ineffective? How had humans anticipated every move, every feint, every strike, without the chaos, hysteria, or desperation that had defined every previous contact with new civilizations? The officers replayed their data feeds, attempting to identify the weak points they had missed, the patterns they had failed to predict. But the result was always the same. Earth had anticipated them. Every contingency they had assumed to be hidden was already accounted for. Every strike they had hoped to blindside was already rendered harmless. And every act of violence they had planned was observed and measured with surgical precision. It was not just a victory over ships or weapons, it was a victory over thought itself. Humanity had taught them, without firing another shot, that intelligence and patience could outmatch any arsenal. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, neutral observers, scholars, and diplomats began to parse the human transmission with a meticulousness born of fear and admiration. Ancient civilizations that had never before seen interstellar conflict unfold at this scale suddenly realized that the defining measure of a civilization was no longer the size of its fleet, the sophistication of its weapons, or the cruelty of its generals. It was the capacity to choose restraint when every instinct screamed for escalation. Humanity had turned a historical weakness into its ultimate strength, the ability to absorb potential annihilation, analyze it, and respond in a way that guaranteed not just survival, but the long-term shaping of galactic politics. Entire political theories were rewritten in the months that followed. Treaties renegotiated before they were signed, alliances reconsidered, and defensive doctrines overhauled. The humans had not merely survived, they had established a benchmark by which all intelligent species would measure themselves forever. Back on Earth, life continued as if nothing had happened. Cities thrummed with the quiet energy of normalcy, oceans lapped against unaltered shores, and the stars above carried no trace of the alien armada to the casual observer. Yet beneath the surface, humanity had shifted irreversibly. Programs once secret now integrated lessons learned from an encounter that had been anticipated decades earlier. Technologies refined, networks expanded, and every citizen unknowingly became part of a living, breathing strategy, one that would ensure no future threat could ever approach undetected or unchallenged. The victory was not celebrated in parades or monuments. It was embedded in the structure of society itself. Survival had become a habit, and preparation an art form. In this quiet continuity, humanity demonstrated perhaps its most terrifying skill, the capacity to endure indefinitely, adapting to the galaxy not through domination, but through mastery of consequence. And so the 17 ships carried their new knowledge home, their crews burdened not with shame alone, but with a fundamental, inescapable truth. They had glimpsed the limits of their understanding, and the limits were defined by humans. Every report sent back to their governments would be tinged with an unspoken acknowledgement of inferiority. Every plan for retaliation clouded by the knowledge that Earth would not react emotionally, but decisively. Humanity's message had been clear. We are neither your enemies to fear nor your subjects to command. We are witnesses to ourselves, and the galaxy will learn what it means to face a species that measures power by patience, rather than aggression. Months passed in measured silence, but the galaxy did not forget. The 17 surviving ships returned to their home systems carrying not just data or logs, but the weight of an idea that could not be erased. Earth had chosen to act, and in doing so, it had redefined what it meant to be powerful. Governments, councils, and militaries across countless star systems reevaluated every assumption they had held about humans, realizing that Earth's victory had not come from overwhelming force, but from an understanding of the universe. Few species ever achieved the understanding that patience, observation, and strategic restraint were weapons in their own right. On their homeworlds, the alien species began to act differently. Fleets that once threatened their neighbors were restrained. Alliances were forged with caution rather than arrogance, and even the most aggressive warlords hesitated. When considering future expansion, humanity's message traveled faster than any ship could, spreading through trade networks, observation posts, and interstellar communication relays. Earth had sent a single, simple transmission, yet its impact rippled outward in ways the humans themselves could scarcely measure. Entire species reconsidered their approach to conflict, realizing that an enemy who could wait calmly while plotting your destruction was far more dangerous than one who charged recklessly into battle. Meanwhile, on Earth, life unfolded with quiet continuity. Cities grew, science advanced, and humanity continued to explore, not to conquer, but to understand. The people who had lived through the invasion carried stories not of horror, but of a lesson so profound it reshaped the collective psyche, that true strength lay not in the annihilation of others, but in mastery over one's own choices. Military doctrines were rewritten, defense systems upgraded, and spacefaring programs expanded. Yet all of it was guided by the same principle the planetary representative had voiced. In that first transmission, survival demanded wisdom, not aggression, and yet the humans themselves did not celebrate. They understood the truth of power, that it is not the victories themselves, but the permanence of their consequences that defines a species. Across the solar system, satellites and orbital stations hummed with the quiet energy of a civilization that had survived annihilation and emerged more capable than ever, but also more aware of the fragile thread that separates life from oblivion. They had seen the shadow of death stretch across the stars, and they had returned it not with fury, but with precision, patience, and unflinching control. Somewhere in the deep reaches of space, the 17 ships continued their journey home. Their crews had become messengers, historians, and witnesses. Every species that learned of their reports would understand a single undeniable fact. Humans were no ordinary civilization. They were survivors, planners, and arbiters of consequence. And the galaxy had only begun to reckon with what that truly meant. The final piece of humanity's message lingered long after the ships had vanished. The galaxy could choose to challenge them, or it could choose to learn from them, but either choice came with an unspoken warning. To underestimate humanity was to invite failure, and to misunderstand it was to court inevitability. In every corner of space, species adjusted their strategies, recalculated their assumptions, and wondered, how had a species so seemingly ordinary become something almost beyond comprehension? The story of 9,700 ships and the 17 survivors became legend not for the number lost, but for the lesson gained. Humanity had not sought glory or vengeance, nor had it displayed brute force. Instead, it had achieved something far more formidable. It had proven that intelligence, patience, and the courage to wait, observe, and choose wisely could outmatch even the most terrifying armada in existence. And in the quiet blue of Earth, spinning steadily around its sun, life continued, unfazed, uncelebratory, and utterly prepared for the next test the galaxy might send. Humanity endured, watched, and waited, for in patience, in calculation, and in control, the true power of the human species had been revealed, and it was a power no fleet, no coalition, and no invader could ever forget.